Yes, sir.
Yeah, thanks, Satya. Today, this ASET has been announced as a Earth Day special. So let me tell you a little bit about the Earth Day before I introduce the speaker. Okay, so Earth Day is supposed to observe somehow the support for the environment, for protecting the environment. And the proclamation setting in motion this annual Earth Days was signed in 1969 by the UN Secretary General, who was then U Thant. And the first one was held the next year on April 22nd, of course. It's become an important annual event across the world, so much so that in 2017, when the Paris Climate Agreement was signed, they made it a point to sign it on Earth Day. Okay, and this year, somehow the environment, I thought, is especially urgent, because in early March, I read that the temperature at the South Pole was 40 Celsius above normal. Now, 40 Celsius is a huge amount. And in the same week, the temperature in the North Pole was 30 Celsius above normal. Okay, the Earth is really heating up. And there are large changes happening. And we may lose things, things, the world around us, the way it looks may change quite dramatically pretty soon. Okay, and we still haven't really understood the web of dependencies between us, our food supply, the influence of other animals, insects, many other animals, their habitats, plants, the weather. It's a very, very complex web. Okay. It's also the subject of really ongoing research. Okay. We have to understand this. The need becomes urgent. But even if it wasn't urgent, it's beautiful science that can be done here. And TIFR, of course, works on part of this. Okay. So today's talk is one example of the kind of science that we do, which is relevant to the idea of Earth Day. I'll come back and introduce the speaker, and then she'll, of course, talk. But let me also remind you that in TIFR, it's not just the idea of to work. Okay, we have a lot of support from other staff members, and one set of people who do actually work directly with our environment are our gardeners. Our gardening, parks and gardens section has been doing tremendous work for for longer than the Earth Day has been observed, and they have won awards. We see the results of their work every day. And tomorrow, the head gardener, Mr. Gumaste, will take registered participants on walks through the garden and explain what they have done. There'll be 3 walks, and many of you have already signed up for this. Okay. So that's the program for April 22nd, which is actually the Earth Day. And today's talk is a curtain raiser. So Jayashree Ratnam is a member of TIFR at NCBS. Okay, she's we run a wildlife biology and conservation master's program, and she's the program director of this program. She tells me that she is a community and ecosystems ecologist. Okay, and today I hope to find out what a community ecologist is. I'm looking forward to this talk. Her special interest is in grasslands, savannas, and forests and their interactions. And she's now currently at this time doing projects to document and understand how we manage, how we conserve our grasslands, how they are being invaded over the years, how they can be restored. And this is something that many of us, when we travel, we see at first hand. Some years back, I had traveled to see the great Indian bustard, which lives in grasslands. Okay. so more than a decade ago. And then recently I found that those grasslands are gone. And those poor birds are gone from there. There are very few of them left now. And if you want to look at them, you have to find some other grassland. But anyway, I look forward to Jayashree's talk about grasslands in general. So over to you, Jayashree.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Sarendru and also Dr. Satyanarayana for calling me to present in this colloquium today. And thank you all who have joined us this afternoon. So the title of my talk today is called Rethinking the Neglected Savanna Biome of the Indian Subcontinent and Implications for Conservation and Management. Although there's a lot of science and data behind much of the work that we do and the topic that I'll be addressing today, my interest today, given that it's Earth Day, was really for hopefully the audience at the end of this talk to get a sense for the urgency and the critical challenges that are faced by the savanna biomes of the Indian subcontinent. And so I'm going to try to tell my story today mostly through words and pictures. So let's begin with a picture, and this is a picture of a savanna. You know, most words carry some visual imagery with them in your mind, and I hope that when you hear the word savanna, what comes to your mind is something that looks like this. Just a second, folks. My screen is not moving down. Yeah, okay. So this is one of my favorite savanna habitats in the world. This is in Amboseli National Park in Kenya. And this is a very classical, typical image of a savanna, which I think, I can't see the audience here today, but I think this is typically what comes to people's minds when they hear the word savanna. And there are several distinctive features of the habitat that you're seeing in this picture. You will see that there are trees dotted across this landscape. They are not closed. The canopy is not closed. They don't stand next to each other and cover the whole area as they would in a forest. They are spread out across the landscape, creating a discontinuous canopy. And in the spaces beneath the trees on the ground, you can see that there is a near continuous layer of grass. Because the trees are scattered across the landscape, this is a very lighted, open habitat. Sunlight is a big part of this habitat. And this really captures the essence of savannas. They are these open landscapes with trees scattered across them in a bed of grasses. And in fact, that is actually the very technical definition that has been used by savanna ecologists who study this ecosystem. So they're called mixed tree grass ecosystems with a discontinuous tree canopy in a continuous grass layer. And it's very critical to note that there are two dominant life forms in this ecosystem. There are the trees and the grasses. And as you can imagine, they are fundamentally different in the way they behave ecologically. But within the bounds of this definition, tree count, the actual number of trees that you would see dotting a savanna, is highly variable. Earth savannas can range from sparsely treed grasslands, as you will see in this image here in the extreme left, to heavily treed woodlands, as you can see here on the right, typically, but not always, along a gradient of increasing rainfall. So let me take a better look at that. So if I think about that then, although the word savanna has a very technical definition, savannas can range from open, arid systems such as here to closed mesic systems such as here. And just to tell you what you're looking at here, as I told you, this was the Amboseli, this is the Kalahari. Here we've got Kruger National Park in South Africa, and here in the bottom right, you're looking at the Myombo woodlands of Zambia. And as you can see, going from the top left to the bottom right, you're going across savannas where trees are sparse to where trees become dense. And this is where the problem lies. When you come to a savanna where the trees become dense like this, if you were to be only looking at the trees and the canopy, you might be forgiven for thinking you're in a forest. It's very easy to think that. What you really need to do then is to go back to that classical definition of the savanna and look down at the ground. And if on the ground you see a continuous or near continuous layer of grasses, you will then know that even though it's pretty woody where you are in a savanna. So this is where the problem that I'm going to talk about today comes in. One of the things you might have noticed as I went through this slide is that all the imagery that I showed you so far is from Africa. And it's really not surprising. Africa is the continent of the savanna. Most of the savannas, most of the charismatic savannas of the world occur there, and they have been beamed across to the planet on National Geographic and Discovery. All of us have sat and watched those videos of the wildebeest in the Serengeti and the lions in the Kalahari. And so this is very familiar imagery to all of us. In contrast, the biogeography of tropical Asia is much, much more Mesic. Okay, so you remember how in this previous image, I showed you that at the bottom right, you've got the Miombo woodlands of India where it gets pretty wooded. Well, many of the savannas in Asia look like that. And that is really a result of the biogeography of Asia versus Africa. So let's look at it comparatively. What I've got here for you are two images of the rainfall regimes of the African continent and the Asian continent. Areas in red tell you that it's very dry. You don't get rain. So those are the warm colors. The cool colors are where you get a lot of rain. So you're entering into forested area. Now, if you just eyeball the African continent and the Asian continents, and let's think about the areas on these continents that we know are not deserts and not closed forests. So something like this. Well, that's where the savannas sit. And as you can see with a quick glance at these two images, most of the savanna-like regions of the Asian subcontinent are blue, that is, they're more Mesic, than they are in the African subcontinent, where they're orange, red, and therefore much more arid. Ergo, when you walk into a savanna in Africa, it would look like this image up here. But when you walked into savanna in Asia, it might look like the image down here. As a consequence, you might, be confused as to whether you are in a forest or in a savanna. Bear that in mind, and that's for the whole of the Asian continent. This is also very true for the Indian subcontinent, which is going to be the focus of my talk today. If you look at a rainfall map of India, which is what I've got here for you, what I'm outlining here for you in red are really the arid and semi-arid areas. And really the rest of the subcontinent is more blue. So a much greater proportion of the savanna-like regions of the Indian subcontinent are Mesic than they are arid relative to the Asian subcontinent. So this is biogeography creating a different kind of savanna in India. Now enter history. Let's take a look at the history of the vegetation classification of India. And here is where these two things really came together. Now, for those of you who are vegetation ecologists know this, but for the rest, most of the formal vegetation classifications of India, and in fact, most of colonial Asia, started during the British time. So they were the ones who just put them down in these books. So for example, Forests of India by Champion and Seth, these sort of classic books, like Champion and Seth, which written in 1935, are the books that we still use today when we think about vegetation classification in India. Yes, we've got some more things coming out lately, but these remain your classic go-to references. Now, the issue there was that when the British came to India and started thinking about classifying the vegetation, they were a colonial power looking to extract and use the natural resources of the colonial lands. So although it was botanical, much of the vegetation classification came from the perspective of forestry and timber operations. It was basically the forest department set up by the British, the foresters who were trained in European and very often in German and French foreign forestry traditions, who went about classifying these lands, always from the perspective of what are the trees in them and how can we use them. As a result, first of all, most of the focus was on the trees. And secondly, all ecosystems with some degree of tree cover were named forests. Okay, so just to make that a little clearer, what I've got here for you is the Olson's ecoregions of the world. I'm going to show you the classification map of India that we use even today. So this is 2012. And what I've done here for you is pulled out the vegetation classification of the semi-arid and Mesic parts of the Indian peninsula. And take a look at that classification. As you will see, the word savanna doesn't really appear much except when talking about the Terai-Duar grasslands and savannas. Everything else on the subcontinent is called a forest. It's a dry deciduous forest, or it's a scrub forest, or it's a thorn forest. So what do these forests look like? Since pictures always say better than words, what we'll now do very quickly is take a tour along the Indian subcontinent, across these regions, and get our eye in for what these habitats actually look like. In the graphs that follow, in the top right, you'll see a map of India. The red dot on it will tell you where on the Indian subcontinent you are, and the image below will show you what that place actually looks like. So here we go. Here we are in central India. This is in Madhya Pradesh. And the classification is called dry thorn forest, but look at what that habitat looks like. That looks, if you didn't know that I was showing you a place in Madhya Pradesh, you might have told me that that is a classic savanna from Africa, but we call it a dry thorn forest. Here we are, Maharashtra, maybe familiar to many folks in TIFR Mumbai. These are all regions around Pune and Mumbai. And here, the classification of this region, which as you can see is open with a grassy layer and short trees in it, it's called a scrub forest. So this is Maharashtra. And now let's go to southern Maharashtra, these absolutely gorgeous savanna grasslands. They are also classified as scrub forests. This is like south of, this is near Pune, south of Pune. I'm going to take you further south now. We are in Andhra Pradesh. This is the Rolapadu Reserve. Again, it looks like a classic savanna to me, but the classification in our books, dry thorn forest. Further south in Andhra Pradesh, across these hills, as you can see, the scrubby growth form with the grasses interspersed in between. Classification, scrub forest. Anyone else in the world would call it a scrub savanna. Moving further inwards to more areas with a little bit more rainfall, here we are in, this is in Amrabad Tiger Reserve in Andhra Pradesh. And these are now classified as dry deciduous forests. And so you can see that from the pictures before to now, we've switched from shorter trees and shrubs to taller trees. So these are tree savannas. But please look at what's between the trees. You can see that there's a very clear grassy layer. This is a savanna, but we call it a dry deciduous forest. Going into wetter regions, this is in southern India, Bandipur Tiger Reserve, not far from Bangalore. Once again, as you can see, you've got a very woody, a woodland savanna look where the trees are now becoming really dense, and you've got below them actually that layer of grasses, but this is again a dry deciduous forest. Let's keep going. I'm going to take you out. We are now going to East Asia. And here you've got in northern Thailand, again, what we savanna ecologists call a tree savanna, but they're classified as Dipterocarp open forest. Please look at the ground. You've got the grassy layer. And here are far out in the Philippines, you've got the pine savannas. The trees are pines, but most of the ground is covered by a grassy layer. These are pine savannas, but they're classified as pine forests. So that then is the story of vegetation classification in the Asian continent in a nutshell. Biogeography and political history together have conspired to leave us here on the subcontinent with an extremely forest-centric nomenclature to all the vegetation that we see around us. Okay, so you don't hear the word savanna. And grasslands, of course, they're recognizable because there are hardly any trees. But those savannas, which are in between, you don't hear about them. Everything is called a forest. So who cares? Why does it matter? Is this just a semantic problem? Does it matter to anything in a real way? And, normally I give this entire topic in a lecture, but I'm just going to quickly summarize it for you here and just say, go back to imagery. Most of us, when we think of forest, think of a dense stand of trees jostling together. And when you look up, light hardly enters the floor and you're in a very dark and shaded environment. That here is on the left. It's a forest. In the forest, trees are densely packed. Because they're densely packed, their canopies overlap. Beneath this overlapping canopy, the sunlight hardly percolates, so that the environment beneath the trees is shaded and cool. In this shaded and cool environment beneath the trees, you don't get sun-loving plants, you get shade-loving plants, typically herbs and tree seedlings. Because it is moist, most of the time, because it's shaded, these environments in nature typically don't burn. Now let's look at what happens on the right when you go to the savanna. Recall that the classic thing about the savanna is that the trees are discontinuous, right? Because they're discontinuous, there's a lot of light in the environment. In the spaces between the trees, which is very lighted, sun-loving grasses grow. In the tropics, these grasses are C4 grasses. They grow profusely in the wet season and they dry out rapidly in the dry season. So that at the end of the dry season, they are like sitting tinder, waiting to burn. They also have a lot of silicates and volatile compounds in their tissue. So a small light, which perhaps in the olden days might have been a lightning regime, but today is mostly anthropogenic, can set these entire habitats on fire, with the fire burning rapidly on the ground and through the grasses. Mostly it's the grass that forms the fuel for these fires. The trees, mostly nothing happens to them. Once the fire burns, the rain comes, the fresh grasses come, and attracted to these fresh grasses are the suite of herbivores who come and feed on them. So now, if we look at these two cartoons, you can see that whether you call it or a forest or a savanna really, really matters, because they are fundamentally different ecosystems and they function differently. In savannas, fires and herbivores are an important part of the ecological regime of these ecosystems. And to go with it, the grasses and trees that grow in these ecosystems have a whole suite of adaptations that make them successful in these open, lighted, fire-prone habitats. In contrast, in the forests, you have shade-loving trees and herbs that don't really like fires, and they don't do very well when it's much lighted. So obviously, whether you call it a forest or a savanna really matters. So in fact, this is what has happened in the subcontinent. And here, let me just stop to give you a little bit of history. Most of our habitats, all those ones that I showed you across the subcontinent are managed as forests. Always thought of fires as a bad thing. You don't want to burn. But in fact, most of these are not forests. They're savannas. They need to burn, but we don't manage them like that. We manage them as forests. And more importantly, when we see an ecosystem that is open and doesn't have enough trees and burns, we think, oh my God, this is a very degraded ecosystem. It's burning because people are setting fires. It's got cattle grazing in it. That can't be right. Surely we should remove all this and have nothing but trees in this landscape. This is a big problem. So in addition to the legacy that we have of a very forest-centric nomenclature, which begs us to do things differently for conservation and management, we have a huge problem in terms of the perception of these ecosystems, because everybody thinks that they need to be managed as forests, and everybody actually thinks that they are degraded ecosystems that have somehow come about as the result of anthropogenic agents. So when we started work on this problem in the Indian subcontinent, what we first tried to do was naturally to look for multiple lines of evidence to show that these are in fact not forests, and they are in fact savannas. I'm going to quickly take you through a little bit of that evidence that we've collected over the past few years. First, we argued that if we, the savannas in Africa, where we worked before we came here, are actually very similar in structure, form, and even species assemblages to the ecosystems that we are seeing here. So the first argument that we made was, if we took the climatic envelope of the savannas of Africa and mapped them onto the Asian continent, well, unless the Asian continent really had savanna-like environments, we really shouldn't see a lot of mapping. And then what did we actually see when we mapped it onto that space? That was our question. And so here, that's what we did. We took the savanna climate spaces from Africa and we mapped them onto Asia. And here is the map that we produced. The areas in dark red by our model are areas with a very high probability of being savannas and not forests. And guess what? They capture with very high accuracy all those biomes that I just showed you. The thorn forest, the scrub forest, and the deciduous forest of Asia, telling us, indirectly providing evidence that what we are looking at in the subcontinent and calling forests are really what are elsewhere recognized as savannas, and they meet many, and they basically sit in the same climatic envelope as found on other subcontinents. So that was one line of evidence. Next line of evidence, like I said, fires and grazers are critical parts of savanna biomes. And if that is true, then there must be some signature of that in the traits of the plants that we look at in these ecosystems. And so we theoretically argued this from first principles in a paper in 2011. And we said, if fires are a critical part of the dry deciduous forests, then when we compare the trees of the dry deciduous forests to the trees of true forests, we should see some predictable differences. One, because fires are important in savannas, we should see thicker barks in the trees of dry deciduous forests relative to evergreen forests, because the function would be to protect these trees from frequent fire. Because savannas are lighted environments and there's no premium on the trees to grow very tall, they can just grow slowly and put out big canopies. We would generally expect that for a given diameter of tree, a forest tree would be much taller because it's racing up there to get at the light than would be a savanna tree. Net result, you would get lower height to diameter ratios in the deciduous forest than you would in true forest, reflective of low light competition in the dry deciduous forest. Third, because because these are open, desiccating environments, we would expect trees to have strategies in how they grow and conserve water to reflect this. And so we would expect deciduous forest trees to have low specific leaf areas. That is, for a given leaf, they wouldn't spread it out over a very wide area because then they would lose a lot of water through transpiration. And if you looked at their xylem and their wood, you might find the wood of dry deciduous forests or savanna trees to be denser, because then you'd get tighter xylem and you would conserve your water. So it would be a conservative growth strategy reflective of the drier, open, desiccated environments in which savanna trees live. And then we set out across the subcontinent. And once again, as you can see, I have a map up here on the right for you. And we went to all these sites where in close proximity in southern India, you find deciduous forests with grassy understories and true evergreen forests with no grasses in the understory. And what we did is we went about measuring a bunch of trees for those traits that I just showed you. And what do our data show? And this was really exciting to us when we found it. What you have here is DD is for dry deciduous, which is really in the new terminology, the savanna, and EG, which is like the wetter forest, which is, so we'll call that forest. So the darker green bars are savannas, the lighter ones are forests. And we compare, here I'm showing you the data for about 96 species of trees from the dry deciduous forests and 200 species of trees from the evergreen forest that we contrasted for these traits. And as you can see, as you would predict theoretically, the height to diameter ratios, can you see my cursor? Yeah. The height to diameter ratios of savanna trees are smaller than for forest trees. The savanna trees have significantly thicker barks than do forest trees, and this is really most telling. If you look at the specific leaf areas of savanna trees, much smaller than for forest trees. And likewise, if you look at wood density, it's not very strong, the trend, but you do see that the wood of savanna trees is denser than that of forest trees. So here we collect another line of evidence from the functional traits of the trees in these ecosystems that is telling us that what we are calling dry deciduous forests in the Indian subcontinent are in fact Mesic savannas. And these traits are telling us, they're telling us that there's a signature of fire and herbivory in these landscapes. More fire than herbivory, so mostly about fire and open habitat. Next, and this is really exciting, this is a wonderful paper done by Ashish Narlikar, who's a fellow savanna ecologist. He's currently doing his PhD at UT Austin. So this is hot off the press. Narlikar and a number of colleagues, many of them in Pune actually, sat about looking at the discovery of new species in the savanna-like biomes of India. And basically what they have here is this map, which we predicted was with very high probability savanna biomes. They went to all these regions. On the right, you can see the photographs. And as you can see, these are mixed tree grass systems, open habitats with very little grass in some places and few trees in other places being much more woody with less grass. But really, you're seeing that whole palette of savannas across the subcontinent. And what Ashish and all argued, went about looking for, is that they said that if these are degraded habitats, then you're not going to see a lot of endemic species in them. On the other hand, if they're ancient, legitimate habitats that have been around for a long time, evolution should have been at play, and you should see a number of endemic species that occur there. And so they looked at the rate of discovery of endemic species in Indian savannas. This data has just come out, and it's amazing. But now that people are looking under the trees over the past 10 years, and they've started describing all the species in there, there has been an exponential rise in the discovery of endemic plants in the Indian savanna habitats, with most of these being in that understory that nobody ever cares to look at because everybody is only looking at the trees. And if you looked at the trees, you would always think that savannas are not very diverse because they are in fact less diverse than tropical rainforests for trees. But when you look in that understory, which has evolved with grasses and herbivores, you find that there's a number of interesting endemic species that occur only there and nowhere else. So a number of different lines of evidence are beginning to show us that savannas of the subcontinent are indeed true savannas. They've been around for a long time. We need to recognize them as such, and we need to manage them appropriately. So that's for the science so far. I should also say that we've also been doing some paleoecological work where we are looking at pollen cores in the fossil, pollen found in the fossil record, as well as we've, people have looked at the fossil record of the Indian subcontinent. And even from this paleoecological data, evidence is beginning to gather for the presence of grassy habitats on the subcontinent from as early as the Miocene. And of course, we know from the paleo record that there have been a number of interesting herbivores and ungulates that are there in the record, suggesting that these open habitats have been around for a long time. So now all of this leaves us with some very important conservation and management challenges that we need to be thinking about with respect to the Indian savanna. And for the rest of this talk, what I'm going to do that is break it down into the kind of challenges that we face in habitats like this, which are the more arid savannas, and the kind of challenges that are being faced in habitats like this, where it is more woody and it looks more like a forest, and these are the Mesic savannas. They're really different, and a big difference is that fire and herbivory in particular becomes much more important in the Mesic savanna. So what is the state of these savannas on the subcontinent? Well, first of all, if you look at the arid and semi-arid savannas of India, the thorn and scrub forests, like I said, they're seen as degraded. And more importantly, in another form of classification to do with the productivity of land, also originating in the colonial times, most of these were administratively classified as wastelands. Because for the foresters looking at them, there wasn't much you could do here. You couldn't get timber. You couldn't really extract a lot out of it. So this was a non-productive habitat. And so let's go ahead and do anything else we want on it. What this fails to realize is that these are unique habitats with many unique fauna. So for example, as Savanna pointed out earlier, here's the great Indian bustard, found only here, endemic. The black buck, the endemic antelope, found only on the Indian subcontinent, foxes. So if you don't have these habitats, all these animals which are endemic and ancient are going to lose out. The tragedy, most of our grasslands, because they've been treated as wastelands, do not have protection status. If you look at the protected area map of India, there are hardly any grasslands and savannas that find protected status. So that is a very important thing that needs to change, and this needs to come at the policy level from the top. Now, what's the other fallout of having, arid, semi-arid, and grassland ecosystems thought of as wastelands and not having any protection for them? Well, they're the first environments to get targeted for all sorts of development activities. And major challenges faced are agriculture and water harvesting projects in the grassland. And recently, in the context of planting trees for carbon sequestration and mitigating climate change, there have been aggressive tree planting drives in the grassland and arid savannas of India. And basically, trees are being planted en masse in these habitats. As you can imagine, this is not an ecologically sound policy. Of course, we all love trees. And I am the first person to understand the romance of a tree. Trees are beautiful. They provide shade. People have written poems to trees. And of course, they're easy to plant. And then everybody really feels good. They feel like they're doing something for the environment. And now, at this point in time, tons of money have been poured into tree planting campaigns. India has pledged to afforest and reforest up to 26 million hectares of land. So we are, pretty far out on the trajectory where we've committed to tree planting everywhere. But planting trees in grasslands can be a bad idea because they fundamentally transform the habitat. You're taking away the light-loving species, you're risking them. So first of all, you're threatening the biodiversity that's endemic. But also, in terms of climate mitigation goals, there can be real negatives. In many cases, tree plantations don't take off or do very well in these grasslands. Many of them fail. What's more, in the process of planting trees and digging trenches, what you're doing is removing and releasing much of the soil carbon. Grasslands and savannas store enormous amounts of carbon in the soil, and by looking only to the trees for that carbon, you're missing the huge soil carbon sink. And therefore, planting trees in grasslands needs to be be avoided if possible, but if it must be done, it has to be done in a very nuanced and careful manner. So that's at the dry end. What about at the mesic end? Well, as you can guess, I said, fires are a big part of these systems. Now, at the mesic end, what you will find is protection status is not a problem. Many of our deciduous forests are a big part of the protected area of network of the country. So if you think of any number of protected areas, whether it's Bandipur, Nagarhole, Tadoba, Andheri, all these places, most of them are dry deciduous forests. So no problem. They've got protection status. What is the problem here? The problem here is that we have fundamentally misunderstood these ecosystems and we are not managing them appropriately. As I said before, because they are thought of as forests, fires are thought to be inimical to these systems. So fires are by law to be excluded or suppressed. And in fact, there's an old law that even makes setting fire a punishable crime, okay? And so, this fundamentally misunderstands the role of fire in these ecosystems. Likewise is the case for domestic herbivory. Many of these ecosystems have for millennia had, communities graze livestock in them, but now they're protected, the livestock is removed. But actually the livestock and their grazing is an important control on what happens in the understory. You remove the livestock and you completely change what's happening. I mean, you remove the grazers, not just livestock, but also wild grazers, and you change what's happening in the understory. So these mesic habitats suffer from mismanagement of both their fire and herbivory regime. And one fallout, which we hear about a lot if you're an ecologist working in southern India, here's an example of a habitat where what has happened in the past 30 to 35 years in subcontinent, in many of the dry deciduous forests, etc., is that the understory, instead of having those grasses, has been completely invaded by invasive woody plants. And many of you may be familiar with Lantana camara. What you're looking at in this image is a savanna, what used to be a savanna, which is now so invaded by lantana that all you can see is a bank of this woody species. Where there should have been grass and where the trees should have been interspersed in that grassy layer, all you can see here is this dense bank of lantana and the trees just barely poking their heads out. That's how bad it has become. And if you ask native tribal communities who've lived in these areas for a long time and who, prior to fire becoming an offense and prior to these lands becoming protected areas strictly managed by the Forest Department, routinely used fire as a management tool, they will tell you, all the elders in the Soliga community will tell you that the explosion of lantana in these habitats, in their understanding, is closely correlated with them stopping their fire regimes, which is that they used to fire the system in the cool season. So the system would burn, but not very intensely. And this would really just open it out, allow the place for new grass to come in. And that system just, worked. The whole system was maintained. And then because you have the grasses, you have the herbivores, because you have the herbivores, you have the predators, the whole ecosystem worked. So this is only a theory. Nobody's tested it, and we don't have the science to fully back it up. But we have a lot of correlational evidence that suggests that this may actually be true. And so again, going back to that old idea that maybe in these habitats, we really need to rethink how we view fire and herbivore. So in a nutshell then, what do we need to do to conserve the savannas of India? Well, if you're in the arid and semi-arid savanna, first, urgently protection status is needed. Where they're in a good shape and they've got their native flora and fauna, let's try and give them protection status. Tree planting programs need to be limited or avoided if possible in these ecosystems. But if they must happen, they must be really nuanced. In the Mesic side of the system, fire and herbivore management urgently needed. I just want to dwell a little bit more on both of these problems, which are now really big problems. As you might all have heard of things like the trillion trees, the billion trees. So tree planting globally has become this big mantra, and it is being touted as a nature-based solution to climate change. And of course it can be, certainly, but not if we don't cut fossil fuels, number one. So it cannot replace reduction in the use of fossil fuels, which is the primary driver of increased carbon dioxide and global warming. But even if it must happen, and it's a good idea, clearly in some places it could be very helpful, it could be a good solution, we really need to think very carefully about it. And in a nutshell, our mantra should be the right species of tree in the right habitat at the right density, not trees planted everywhere willy-nilly. We need to prioritize. First, on a priority basis, we should say, well, if there are forests, true forests that are degraded, let's restore them. Where can we plant trees without affecting, native habitats? Places that have been already highly transformed. So let's plant our trees in urban and peri-urban areas. Let's plant them along roads and highways. Let's plant in agricultural areas, perhaps along the edges of fields. And let's very carefully survey which parts of our agricultural landscape will benefit in a sustainable way from a transition to agroforestry, from grassy crops, and transition to that there, because these are already ecosystems that are so highly changed that we really can't take them back. But we can manage them today for excellent carbon benefits. That is where we need to be focusing, and we need to be avoiding the planting of trees in grasslands and arid savannas. But in fact, the latter is exactly what is happening, and that is really around the politics of land. Because many of these are wastelands and open spaces where land is cheap, they're also often the easiest areas in which to set about doing massive tree planting campaigns. So here, I think what we really need to do, if the problem here is that we can say no, but probably the economic juggernaut related with tree planting efforts is already really huge and the wheels are churning. Maybe we can't stop it, but we can really work with the people who are doing these plantation drives to set up nurseries of the appropriate trees. Let's not plant eucalyptus and acacia everywhere. Let's plant native species, and that too tailored exactly to the different habitats in the country. And in addition to trees, let's start nurseries with grasses, and let's go with a campaign of mixed tree grass planting to try and retain the savanna-like habitats in the way they are. What about the Mesic habitats? Like I told you that many of these habitats are invaded by Lantana camara. Well, they're not just invaded. It's pretty shocking. Recent estimates in Bandipur Tiger Reserve and BRT Tiger Reserve show that up to 70 to 80% of the understory in these Mesic savannas are now fully invaded by Lantana camara. I mean, it is drastic. So we've almost, shifted the ecosystem into a new state. Repeated efforts at removal of the invader have failed. They come right back. In this realm, what I want to say is we very, very urgently need good science, massive at-scale field experiments to come up with workable solutions using combination of semi-natural removal, controlled burning and grazing to fight the menace of the invader. So with that, I'll stop. I want to say thanks to all the many people who have inspired me. I have fantastic colleagues The savanna community globally is fantastic. And now we also have a growing community of savanna biologists in India. So I'm really excited to be part of it. And thanks to the institutions. And I'll stop with that.
Thank you very much, Jayashree. So once again, I'll invite back Saurindu.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, so we want to kind of make some kind of comments before we also invite any other questions from the audience.
Right. I had lots of questions actually, because what about grasslands in the mountainous areas of India? Surely there are some.
Oh, yes. So you've got all these alpine grasslands, right? The alpine meadows. Like if you're hiking in the Himalayas, about 3,000, etc., you'll see these big alpine meadows. Yeah.
And
those are treated as grasslands. So it's okay. But even there, now there are major tree planting drives. If you go to Ladakh today, it is crazy. They are planting up massive areas of that semi-desert kind of habitat with trees, poplar trees. And this is all a part of saying, this is how we're going to combat climate change. But in that arid area, if you plant trees, which really need a lot of water, you're going to change the eco-hydrological regime. By planting these trees that are dark, you're going to change the albedo of the land. You're going to change the way the land absorbs heat and warmth. You're just doing, what really shouldn't be happening in that case. But this is really, so it's a really critical problem. And the reason I wanted to bring it up today is, I forgot to say one thing during the talk is that, if you look at the invasion problem, we have waited so long that now it's almost impossible for us to manage lantana and get our ecosystems back. It's become a gargantuan challenge. I am very afraid that if we don't act in time to save our grasslands and savannas from these tree planting efforts, not all, but when they are planted at the wrong densities, wrong species in the wrong place, I think, we'll be in the same situation 20 years from now where we'll have no way to go back. So, proactively preventing it is going to be much better than trying to backtrack once you've transformed the land.
Saurindu, maybe we'll just take a question first from Saurav, and then get back to you for further questions. Yeah, Saurav, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. This was a very fascinating talk. So one thing I couldn't quite understand, if I am hoping that you may elaborate on that a little. So I always thought that if you have a large tree for any given, say, surface area, it will produce more oxygen, sink more carbon dioxide, etc. But you mentioned that if you change savanna and plant trees there, instead of doing what I just said, you are basically reducing the soil sink of carbon, and you are actually not helping the environment. Can you please elaborate on this? This was very new to me.
Okay, so the thing about planting the trees, if you're going to plant trees that are not appropriate in the savanna habitat into it, and they are trees that are fundamentally primed to grow really tall and large, they're also going to need a huge amount of water to do it. And savanna ecosystems are basically arid, semi-arid, mesic. They don't have those amounts of water. So you're actually not going to, first of all, get them growing as well as you think. And if they do, they will really change the hydrological regime of the water. Meanwhile, what you would have done to plant that tree is dug this big pit, and put the tree in it with a whole bunch of other things. What you would have done in that process is removed a thick bank of roots, which really store a lot of soil carbon in the savanna. So in savannas, you get a lot of biomass going in the roots, and there's a lot of carbon stored there. You don't see it. But in these tree planting drives, we're going to release it. And when you release it, it's all going to go into the atmosphere. So that's the problem there. That's the push and pull of tree planting versus retaining the grasses in the savanna. And so I don't know if you saw that photograph. I showed you one of Hasragata, grassland pockmarked with these huge pits. Basically, they've taken out all that soil and the carbon, which was put in there over many years of growth, and chucked it. And it's going to just get released. So if you're going to talk about how much carbon you sequester, you need to account for that loss.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay. There's one question from Aditi. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question directly? You did type, but Aditi?
Am I audible?
Maybe. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. So my question is basically, you mentioned that there have been some attempts to tackle this problem, but they failed. So can you elaborate a bit on that? What exactly by tackling and
Okay, Aditi, your voice was coming in and out, but I think you were saying, why have the efforts at removing lantana, etc., failed? Is that right?
and what exactly are these attempts? Like, what does it mean to tackle these? Because it seems difficult that how would you, like, for example, tackle this entire lantana growth that has happened, say, in the BR Hills, right? So how does one even go about tackling it?
Exactly. It is a massive problem. And so just in terms of the removal, so what the forest department and NGOs and others who've tried to, who want to try and get rid of this thing, they basically go and uproot the plant. Okay, they uproot the plant, and initially they were just cutting the plant, right? And they found out that lantana, well, if you just cut it and leave it, it'll grow right back. It's like a hydra. It grows back 100 heads. So it'll grow back even more profusely. So that was the initial efforts at removing the invader. It didn't work. Next, people said, in order to prevent it from resprouting, what we need to do is cut at the rootstock or uproot it entirely, okay, so that it can't come back. That's something they did. The reason that also doesn't work is because if you've seen a lantana plant, it's full of flowers and then it's full of berries, so it produces gazillion seeds. Those seeds sit in the soil seed bank and they are completely dominating the soil seed bank. You remove the lantana, you uproot it, bam, you get a carpet of lantana seedlings and they grow really fast. And within 2 years, you wouldn't know the difference. Okay. So it is not a trivial problem. I hear you when you say, how on earth are you going to do it? And there are many times when I really wonder, can we? Have we basically crossed the threshold into a different ecosystem from which there's no going back? Maybe. I don't know the answer, but I don't know it because we haven't tried, because we haven't done the right kinds of experiments, okay? And so I'm very excited right now, involved in a large experiment with colleagues where we are trying a bunch of different approaches. And so you asked me, how can you do it at scale? Well, my answer as a savanna ecologist is that the one way you can do it at scale is if you use fire as a control mechanism. Why? Because unlike cutting something manually, if you can burn a habitat, you can cover large parts of habitat to burn, right? If you can do this safely, and if you can do it, in an ecologically sensible manner, maybe we can try and use fire as a tool to get rid of the lantana. And so what we are now suggesting is that some kind of semi-manual removal, because, manually it's just really painful. We've worked with crews. Your hands are bleeding, it's really hard. So some sort of hand cutters, at least, to help with that, followed by a couple of maybe cool season burns to try and destroy that seed bank. Remember, that bank is full of lantana seeds. If we can get rid of that, and then if we can facilitate with some amount of native grass seedling planting, so that come the next season, the grasses maybe have an advantage over the lantana and can outcompete them, we can try. I don't guarantee answers. In fact, I feel very pessimistic. And when you go to BRT and you see the elephants stuck in the lantana, can't move forward, can't move back, it is so depressing. And I think it's really very sad that we have let it come to this state. Obviously, we needed to have acted 20 years ago. So, yeah.
Yeah. We'll go to next question. This is from Radhia Gupta.
Hi, Radia.
Please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Is that for me, Radia?
Yes, that's for you.
Hi, Jayashree. I had some very basic question that is the blame, all of this blame lying on the initial classification that took place here by calling it forest, dry forest, scrub forest instead of the savanna? And if that classification initially had been called a savanna, would our problems been much less? And would the tree planting, etc., not have happened, or there would have been a better understanding of what the savannas need to survive and the balance, ecological balance? Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Radia. I think I want to say that at least some of our problems stem from that misunderstanding of the ecosystem and calling it a forest. So definitely, because that influenced how management practices were set in place. So, they were classified as forests and they were managed to have the tree. And it was thought that if you have fires, trees might die. This is true for the wet forests of Europe, etc. It's not true for savanna trees. They do very well, even if they're burnt. In fact, most adult savanna trees simply do not die from a forest fire. But in the absence of that ecological understanding, and you can't blame anybody, they were simply a product of their time and their education and understanding of the ecosystems they'd been in before. So there's nobody to blame. It is just what happened. And they actively put in measures to keep out fire and grazing, and that I do think fundamentally transformed these systems. I do think it has had an important role. And in fact, by the time that the British left the country, and this is towards like the late 1930s, they began to recognize it. They were walking through the forests of North India and they realized that they were hardly seeing any sal trees that were regenerating. And it turns out that sal really wants a fire for its seedlings to regenerate. They had observed it and they had started wondering whether keeping fires out was perhaps a mistake. And they even actively reinstated some management burns in some areas. So yes, I do think this long history, and it's relatively long, right? We're talking 200, 300 years of doing this, has had, has certainly had some impact on the state of these ecosystems today. But tree planting drives, I think, have come after the fact. They're not necessarily linked. Tree planting is linked to our warming of the earth through our accelerated use of fossil fuels, which began about 50, 70 years ago. And today, and that's really what's the Anthropocene, right? The Anthropocene is really the age of fossil fuels. And the way it has warmed the earth, and then people's understanding that trees sequester carbon and planting and growing trees might be a way to suck some of that carbon back from the atmosphere. That's what driving the tree planting campaigns. So they're not exactly, the cause and effect are not the same for the two major problems that we face today. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Radia?
Yes, it did. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe we'll bring in once again Saurindu. He said he has some more questions, and maybe it's also time to kind of summarize.
Yep.
Jayashree, I wanted to ask a couple of last questions to kind of bring us back to today and the problems that we face. So let me ask both the questions and you can answer. So first thing, is the forestry department of various states, are they willing to talk to ecologists to rethink the classification schemes that they use? That's number one. Number two, I see in various places where I go for holidays, I see fire being used to control, and these are places which are protected as grasslands, Kaziranga, for example. Okay. So is that practice transferable between one forest department and another?
Yeah. Oh, both are great questions, Sarindu, because of course, in the end, the forest department, as the steward of these protected areas, makes a lot of these decisions. I should say that the forest department has begun to recognize that the problem of lantana has become really intractable. They are in various states inviting scientists and others to come in and try to fix the problem. So there is some movement on that front, but I think, fundamentally, ecologically, at this point, we are facing such a difficult problem that I do not know, what we can actually do, as I mentioned to Aditi. But yes, there are some moves. On the other hand, I find that we've often tried to talk about fire and fire being negative. And that can be really difficult, for example, in the southern forest departments, because we are in a very Mesic part of the country. And really, the things that people associate the south with, are the tropical forests of the Western Ghats, etc., where, of course, fire is not good. You don't want those places to burn. And so for people who are really, where their awareness of biomes is really leaning towards the tropical forest biomes, it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to talk to them about fires as being a positive tool in some places and not. And this is very interesting because we've had many conversations. So in some cases, there is a recognition that it can be used. In other cases, it's not. So I think it's a very individual sort of view that they come with, depending on where they grew up, what sort of habitats they're really familiar with, etc. And so what I hope is that eventually these sorts of ideas, like we talked about in this talk today, should become integral parts of the curriculum of forest officers when they are trained in the IGFNA and other such things. And if we could move to actually incorporate them in curricula at that stage, then maybe the change will come. But I think it'll be slow. And like I said, it's not even. Some people recognize that it can be used as a tool and some not. And to your question about North versus South, so for example, you're right. In the North, there's been a long history of burning in the riparian grasslands, etc. And that had to do with a very early recognition that things like rhinos needed to be able to feed on the grass there. And because those were very important, from the perspective of tourism, etc., in those habitats. So there's also about what does the forest department manage a particular habitat for? So it's rarely just about the ecology. There's tourism, there's economics, and so all of that has to come together. And in the North, it has always been the case that you burn the grasses, you close the parks from November to Feb, March, you do the burning so that the fresh grass comes, and then when you open up, you've got all these herbivores out there eating the grass, right? And how transferable is it across states? I don't know the answer to that question. So each state deals with the forest as an independent state subject. I imagine it must really be up to the individuals at that time. I'm sure it can be done, but yeah, I think all these outcomes will be very case specific, individual specific.
Okay. Sarindu, say anything more?
Thanks. I would like to just end by thanking Jayashree. It was very instructive, at least for me, and I'm sure for many of us. And I do hope that as TIFR, we can do something to spread these messages. Okay, the kind of message that you're bringing, for example, we can probably provide fora for bringing in concerned officials, and maybe we can begin to talk with them. And it's all part of our outreach. Go ahead and do this.
That's right.
So thank you again, Jayashree. And I would like to remind you all of the walks again tomorrow. So thanks. Over to you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you, Jayashree.
Bye.
Hello, wonderful talk. Thanks, of course, Sarendu, for making all this possible. So thank you. Thank you.